Welcome everyone to today's Kelsey Museum Virtual Flash Talk. For those of you new to this format, a Flash Talk is a brief presentation about a current research project, followed by a lengthy Q&A. Our presentation today should last about 15 minutes, and then we'll have another 15 minutes for questions with you, our audience. Please use the Q&A feature or the chat feature to ask questions. And finally, as you heard from the disembodied voice, we are recording this event. Our speaker today is Kelsey Museum Director Nick Terrenato. Nick is also the director of the Gabby Project and a professor in the Department of Classical Studies. Today, he will be speaking to us about his research into the origins of Rome and other Iron Age Italian states. So welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. So here really today, I'm often have been described as prone to oversimplifications, but this is nothing compared to what I have to do here to condensate this whole issue in 15 minutes. So essentially the debate on the origins of Rome has shifted from talking about Romulus and talking about the mythological narratives to a more archaeological narrative based on actual settlements and not just on Rome. Really, the realization has been that Rome, the evolution of Rome, has been progressing apace with the whole region, and so often you have information from other sites that is relevant for Rome. The other thing to say is that central Italy and Western central Italy precisely, that is to say the coasts of Tuscany and Latium, really had no prior experience of urbanism before the first millennium BCE. This is in sharp contrast with, first of course, Greece and Crete, but many other places had really exciting Bronze Ages, Sardinia, Sicily, you name it. Even the Pope Lane had a more interesting Bronze Age than Central Italy. In Central Italy, really, the baseline that we're starting from is just a bunch of villages. That is, you see here, this is of course the Tiber. Rome is down here, and these are final Bronze Age settlements. So towards the end of the second millennium BCE, you have these small villages, a multitude of them. These are, of course, only the ones that have been archaeologically located, that would have maybe about 100 people apiece. So definitely not cities. And they would have no monumental architecture. They would only have huts. And that is the story. So when you transition to the Iron Age, sometime in the very early first millennium BCE, a major event happens. All the villages that you see are, there are open circles, are abandoned, and population is instead concentrating in a number of, a much smaller number of larger places. And this is conventionally understood to be the first step towards urbanism, because virtually all of these places where population concentrates at the beginning of the Iron Age will become cities. Rome itself, and of course Veii, Tarquinia, Tripetri, and so on and so forth, Fulcini, and so Gabi, and so on and so forth. So it seems like that in order to become a city in the early first millennium BCE, this was a required first step. And what we know and we're beginning to understand of these places, and again, you see some of them, is that this population concentration, which sometimes, it's conceived as a synoikism, which is of course a Greek term that really much more closely applies to the Greek situation. This is a bit peculiar, because what is now evident is that these people that are coming in from these villages are settling in small groups on the same plateau. You see these little shaded areas. This is Gabi, this is Veii, this is Tarquinia, but this is true of absolutely all of the sites that we're looking at. That is to say that rather than living all together as a single community, they scatter themselves across the plateau that will later on become a city. And so if we were to schematize this, this would be the situation in the Bronze Age, and each big square is a village, and the diamonds are the tombs that are of course around the village. And this is the situation in the early Iron Age. Some, but not all of the villages, the majority of the villages, the population has converged onto this area that will later become a city. But they still, you have habitation groups that are separate from each other. And at least in some cases, this is still a bit controversial, but at least in some cases, and certainly in the case of Rome, the tombs are between one hut cluster and the next. So they're not outside of the city yet. We're in the 9th century BCE here. The tombs are, and this, why is this important? Because it was a long-standing taboo in central Italy to not to have tombs where people live. So if you have tombs here, it means that these areas in between the hut clusters are not considered to be part of the city yet. And these are the kind of huts that were still, the architecture is, very unremarkable. These are mud huts. This is, of course, a reconstruction of one from Ficana in Latium. Often the boundary of that is defined, within which these habitation units insist, is a natural boundary. Here we are at Tarquinia, and you very clearly see in this image how there is a plateau, and this is the natural edge of the plateau that corresponds to the edge of the habitation clusters. So, of course, this suggests that these people are very interested in communal defense. So they don't live together yet, but they're defending this plateau together, which of course offers obvious, immediate military benefit. So what is the next step? The next step is that in the 8th century, all adult burials are now pushed out of the perimeter of the future city. And this is where they are. You still have the old Bronze Age villages continuing, and that you still have separate habitation, but the tombs have been pushed out. And this has been suggested that this is one of the first communal actions that these people are taking. They are establishing this rule that adult burials can only be outside this perimeter of the plateau, which is progressively more and more fortified. So there's still no city walls, but you have earthen walls, you have sometimes ditches. They are clearly trying to make these places more that in almost all cases are already naturally defended, to make them more naturally defended. An interesting wrinkle is that infant burials, which are the little circles, infant burials will always continue to be allowed within the city. And this is what we have found at Gabi, beautiful infant burials with incredible great goods, which tells us that, of course, that this is funerary display that probably is maintained within the city, and that it must be maintained by elites. These are very expensive items, especially for a baby who's not even a year old. And so this tells us that in probably every one of these habitation clusters, you have elite groups, so that each of these places is nucleated. So instead of all the elites concentrating in the center of the future city, each habitation cluster probably has its own elite group or groups. It is only, you have to wait till the 6th century to really see the clear indications of city organization. That is to say that, at this point, it's only at this point that you have proper masonry walls. And it is only at this point that habitation reorganizes itself. probably around public squares, such as the Forum in Rome. Infant burials are still possible, and this is the first time that these people are living side by side. Now, I hasten to add, I'm not suggesting here that all the people who lived in the blue habitation cluster are taking the same side of the Forum, although it'd be cool, but we cannot prove that. All I'm saying is that the people who used to be scattered all around the plateau of the city now seem to gravitate much more towards the center of the city, and especially around the attractor that is represented by the Forum. So this and from this point onwards, you have regular cities. There are temples, there are roads and road systems and drainage and all of that. So all the things that we know are part of the classic phase of urbanism in central Italy. But this prehistory of these formation steps are crucial, well, in part because they tell us the important story about the formation process, but also I have argued, and not everyone believes it, that they also reveal something to us about the very nature of these states. So this is not just how they get there, but just like the embryology of an organism often explains something about the way the organism functions and its evolutionary qualities, so to speak, traits, I should say. So in the same way, this formation process probably tells us something about the nature of these places, of these communities and these governments. And the point here, so that's why I was talking about, well, fragmentation, because you see this, fragmentation, which sometimes is called a multifocality. So there are a number of foci rather than everything growing out of a central center of central attractor. But also, and what this means is that probably power within these communities is not highly centralized. It's certainly not highly centralized for all these centuries that I have reviewed. But even when you get to the 6th century, yes, we know about kings, but we have to wonder how much power these kings really had. Because what we see, and this, the early history of Rome here is very important and gives us very precious information. You have these family groups, these clans, these gentes, these lineages, these houses, however you want to call them, that continue to have a lot of power. And why do I say that? Well, because Roman history, early and to be honest, late as well, is dotted, is peppered with a number of events during which we see that family power is acting in a way that is not aligned with the state regulations. This is a famous Etruscan family tomb where what you see is a whole lot of elite people killing each other. Conveniently, they're labeled, and we know that there are, these are what we're looking at are elite factions that are stabbing each other. Now, this is not supposed to happen. We know that it's not supposed to happen in most governments, but especially in these cities, we know that, for instance, carrying weapons inside the city was forbidden. And yet these people occasionally do it. So what I'm getting at here is that while states emerge that have the defined rules of behavior, such as the one about the tombs or the one about violence in the city or about, obeying the law and all of that, these rules are only part of the story, or rather, they're only valid at times. And at other times, it all falls apart. So hence the fragility. And we see this, it continues. We have evidence for this in the 6th century, in the 5th century, in the 4th century, and it just continues. One classic example is one time when in the in the course of the early Republican period, a powerful family, the family of the Fabii, wants to wage war against they, but the Senate won't vote on the war, and so they just wage a private war. They just go with their clients and so this is essentially a feudal war. You have a local lord with his followers who is waging war against an actual state. And this is something that in various forms happens in Rome. But there was a famous example where we have a cache of helmets from an Etruscan city where all these helmets are inscribed, and we're told that these are family helmets, that these are helmets that belong to a family army. And there's dozens and dozens of them. So private armies remain a factor. And this is just one of the many instances in which you see these other actors that are not states still claiming power, violence, political influence, and all of that. In other words, politicians being politicians, which should not surprise us too much. Now, this has often been recognized in Roman history, but it has been described as a flaw in the system. It's a form of an imperfection of the state. And you can argue instead, and I've been arguing instead, and together with political scientists like Chuduri here, that these weak states, right, states that are fragile, states that can fall apart, actually have, they can persist and they have greater resilience often than strong states. And in any case, that they are often the right solution for a power of landscape, a landscape of power that is highly fragmented, like we know it was the case in Iron Age Central Italy. So I'm out of time here. I just want to conclude by saying that the point here is that the formation process of states and cities in Central Italy has the potential to reveal something that can be seen as a long-term trait of states in Italy and elsewhere, to the point where you can potentially even understand something about the period of the civil wars at the end of the first millennium BCE through the lens of what was happening right at the beginning of the same millennium. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Nick. Anybody have any questions? Open it up to our audience. Just type them in the chat or the Q&A. It always takes a little bit longer because everyone has to type out.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That is fine.
Here we have one in the chat. So the faction violence at the end of the Republic had its origins in deep history. This is from Michael Nolte.
Yeah, well, that's one possibility. I mean, of course, I'm not suggesting that what happened in the 9th century BCE entirely determined what was going to happen in the 1st century BCE. However, for instance, there are elements that, yes, can be explained in terms of this long history. So, for instance, when we see Pompey the Great, despite being, a Republican magistrate, and in theory, he has, the ability to raise the Roman army and, have the entire Roman army behind him. When, push comes to shove and a civil war is breaking out and Caesar is coming into Italy, what he does is that he goes to the region of Italy, the Picenum, where his family was from, and he raises, the army that he's going to use to fight Caesar in his ancestral lands. Now, if really by the late Republic, Rome had become this, simulation, the approximation of a nation state, he wouldn't have needed to do that. And what this tells you is that even at that late stage, there are still these deep connections. There are these deep connections between certain aristocrats and certain groups of dependents that can be leveraged for politics and violence. Did infant burials completely disappear from the cities at a later stage of development? No, they never disappear. They continue to infants. Unfortunately, infant mortality was a commonplace event. We estimate that about 50% of infants would not reach age 1, would not survive age 1. And so this was something that, so they were buried typically in the garden of the house, a bit like, sometimes we do that with our pets. And this has to be understood in the context of, this was, a common event that probably would happen, in a large extended family would happen a lot. And because a proper funeral would cost a lot of money and especially impose a very strict mourning period where no one could get married, no one, there were all these restrictions that would take place. If you were to mourn properly, each infant who died, the extended family would never really be out of mourning pretty much. And so we think that, it's this functional reason why we think that infant burials are always kept, treated differently. They continue to be buried near the house when possible. We also see them buried occasionally in the regular graveyard. Oh, I'm sorry. How do you see the role of religion and other institutions in structuring relations between these competing families? That's a great question. Well, religion is another arena where aristocratic power and city power clash. Now, once again, the baseline here is that these Bronze Age, what we understand of Bronze Age religion for central Italy is that it is mostly ancestor worship. So obviously each family, like we see in many other cultures, each extended family would worship its own ancestors, which means that it's another element of fragmentation, because of course, typically my ancestors are not your ancestors. And so I have my own private religion and you have your own private religion. And we really don't see each other as congregants of the same religion, even if it's structurally the same religion, of course. When we see, and when, another remarkable thing is that when we see this concentration on these plateaus that will later become cities, we see on the whole very weak evidence of centralized religion. It is only really towards the end of the 7th and the 6th century BCE that you have uncontroversial, major public cult places that are developing. And however, the case has been made in some instances, for instance, the Tarquinia, that there were, already from the earlier periods, there were communal cults. It's a difficult case to make. So I'm not, and what seems to be happening is that for this emerging communal cults, they are instead introducing more like the kind of deities that we'll see later. They're often connected with natural phenomena, sun gods, thunder gods, moon goddesses, and so on and so forth. And so but the ancestral the religion of ancestors will never disappear. And so once again, you have this two levels. You have the level of the ancestors, and that only works for the extended family and for the descendants of that ancestor. And you have the level of the public cults that are, you know, after all, the sun shines for everyone. So the sun god is the same for everyone. And but they never you know, the larger religion, the communal religion, never subsumes the ancestral religion, which will continue you know, to exist down to the Christian, you know, the Christianization.
And we have another question from Marion in the chat. It says, inside walls, when is there archaeological evidence for civic organizations for political activity?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very late. This is something that we're trying to. We were we're hoping that Gabi will help answer. But you know, by and large, evidence for any kind of fora or comitia, so for places for public meetings or even royal palaces, is very minimal. At least down to the 6th century BCE. On the whole, the best evidence that we have is for Rome, where this valley between the Palatine and Capitoline Hills is filled in the course, you know, not exactly clear when, but it's filled in, and certainly is more or less filled in by the end of the 7th century. And that is the formation of the forum. But we should, when we say forum, we shouldn't think colonnades and rostra and you know, or anything of that kind. There is strong evidence that early fora are just beaten earth surfaces. So these are, once again, cities that are investing very little in these kind of monumentalization, which is remarkable. And these are wealthy people. These are people who can bury pounds of metal with their infant, and yet they won't chip in to you know, I don't know, do even a fraction of what the Greeks are doing at the same time in their agori. Which again suggests that only just enough political, military, and economic power, only a limited amount of wealth is devolved to the government. So on the whole, you know, if we were to express it in modern political terms, we would say that these are cities that have very small governments, whereas definitely Greek cities have big governments. And of course, no political judgment of any kind on you know, in either direction, just to describe the phenomenon.
Any final questions? A couple more minutes. All right. All right. Well, if we don't have any further questions, thank you so much, Nick. This is fascinating. I love hearing your presentations on this. I think this is the so much fun to think about. Yeah.
It was fun for me too. Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us. Please do join us next month on June 4th at noon for our next Flash Talk. Our speaker will be Dr. Richard Redding, and he'll be speaking about his research into the diet of the construction workers at Giza in Egypt. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.